Hello again, continuing my prep for the first Turnip28 game, making some dangerous terrain pieces. I need 3 of these for the first scenario, so taking some foam core, cutting it to the right size, which is about 12 inch by 12 inch, and then beveling the edges with a dirty knife. Dangerous terrain can be anything from a swamp to a spike pit, or any kind of hazardous material. So I'm going to go with a swamp, a teeth chasm, and a root pit. I started off by taking some underfloor insulation board, ripping it up into rough pieces, and then gluing it around the outside, so I can make some pits and hollows, but still have a nice flat area to position things on top of. At this point I was using hot glue to attach the elements to the base. I wanted to add some stone ruins to one of the pieces, to contribute to the whole medieval post-apocalyptic Napoleonic vibe that Turnip28 has. So I took some styrofoam, cut a corner of it off, then I pushed a stone texture in using a scrunched up tinfoil ball before carving it up into some slabs and some bricks, so I could have a bit of a floor that had once been, then using some hot glue to attach that on. To blend the rest of the base and get rid of some of the corners, I mixed up a batch of sculptor mold, then applied it on, first using a tiny sculpting tool, then getting bored and using my fingers instead. Using your fingers also means you can have a nice smooth transition, where you want there to be a bit of a slope. One of the examples of dangerous terrain is called a root pit, which is up to you to interpret how you want. So I decided it would be a bunch of large central spores linked together with roots, kind of growing out and attacking anything that came near. So for the central spores I took some polystyrene balls, cut them in 2, and then some smaller balls as well to be kind of outlying hubs. Jumping over to the swampy piece, I took some half beads and glued them down in the middle of the pools using some matte Mod Podge, so we'd get a nice bubbling swamp. Jumping back to the root pit, taking some of the armature wire, which is a nice thick but very easily malleable wire, and gluing it attached from one end of the polystyrene balls to another one, then securing it with Mod Podge. In hindsight, I probably could have done a bit more to break up the spherical texture here, maybe have a few pieces of wire going over the top as well, but that's something I can try on a later piece. To give the roots a nice crusty texture, I took some polyfiller and an old knackered brush, then pasted it over the top, giving it a bit of a stipple so you get a nice bumpy texture on it. Next up, grab your bucket of cork flock and put a tiny bit in a cup, then mix it together with some fine sand, black gesso and PVA to make a nice basing paste. By mixing up the ratio of cork and fine sand, you can make a lot of different textures, so I'd recommend trying and just experimenting with what you find makes the best base texture. You also don't need to add the black gesso here, but I find it does help to go towards the base layer and the colouring. Using a sculpting tool, I then smeared it over the base, blending the various elements together and giving it a nice dirt texture. For the teeth chasm, I got some cheap fake acrylic teeth off the internet, then plinked them out and pushed them into the texture paste while it was still wet. Then if it needed it, I put a bit more basing paste around the base of the tooth, just to cover any gaps that might be there. With everything fully dry, I then went in with another coat of black gesso and hit any parts which hadn't been covered by the basing paste, as well as any gaps where you could see some of the underlying materials showing through. This was followed by a base coat of burnt umber. Won't be doing much on the painting steps, because this is meant to be quite a dark, earthy tone, so just going with a base coat of burnt umber, followed by a very light dry brush of white paint, while also pulling out the stonework with a slightly heavier dry brush of the white paint as well. For the root work, I went in with a yellow paint and gave it a dry brush, but I felt this was a bit too bright, so I went in later with a beige paint and dulled it down some. I used a dark green for the base of the pools, and made it more concentrated in the very bottom recesses, where you would get a deeper part of the water. This next step wasn't picked up very well by the camera, but I used a very light green and gave a very, very light dry brush over the ground texture as well. I also picked out the details, such as the teeth. Taking coarse turf and combining it with matte Mod Podge, I then mixed up a basing slime, so we could have some nice low-level foliage and shrubs along the base as well. This stuff can be a real pain to apply, so at one point I gave up, applied Mod Podge, and sprinkled the coarse turf on top of that instead. But this would come back to bite me when it came to painting the turf. As mentioned before, I decided that the roots were a bit too bright and yellow, so with a beige paint, dulled them down, made them look a bit more earthy, and a bit more kind of mouldy and spory. I also dry brushed this around the base of the roots, so it would look like they're slowly creeping out and having a kind of rotting influence on the land around them. To blend in the turf and darken it down, I took some diluted black paint and applied it over the top, so it sinks in and you get a nice natural kind of blended effect. And where I'd used it as a paste, this was a lot easier because the entire thing was solid, so I didn't have any loose particles coming off at the same time. For the water effect, I used Vallejo still water texture and dripped a reasonable amount in, just where I wanted it to pool up in the recesses, using it mostly on the swamp piece, but a few drops in the teeth chasm as well. Taking some brown paint, I also hit the very tops of the foliage, so it would appear like they're dying and muddy, which is a very Turnip28 type thing. Grabbing an assortment of tufts, I applied a few throughout. Where they were a bit too bright, they got the same treatment as the turf, and darkened down with a black paint, then followed by a brown one. I wanted to add some leaves to the base, so taking some paper, I then made a bath out of water and several shades of brown paint dripped into it. Submerging the paper inside, I let it sit for about 30 seconds to a minute before fishing it out and letting it dry on a polystyrene block. While that was still wet, I took some darker brown paint and deepened the colour on the front, doing the same process with some light green paint. They lost a lot of the colour intensity when they dried, but they were still okay, so I scrunched them up to add a bit of texture, then unrolled them and took my leaf hole punches and started punching some leaves out. One of these punches is from Green Stuff World and the other is from AK Interactive. Using the tiniest amount of Mod Podge imaginable, I started attaching the leaves to the base as well. With that final touch, the terrain pieces were done. 3 pieces of dangerous terrain, ready for the first game of Turnip28, where some unfortunate people will probably not make it across them. The water texture is still a bit cloudy in places, but that clears up after a few days. And if not, it just looks like swamp water anyway. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope to catch you next time.